And the preface. 5 years ago, if someone had asked me to make a list of all the topics I might want to research for a possible book, the early death of a mother or father would not have made the top 10. I did not set out to write this book. In many ways, this book chose me. In the summer of 1991, I was interviewing women about their lives for what would eventually become a previous book of mine, Down from the Pedestal, moving beyond idealized images of womanhood. The 70 women with whom I spoke shared many common experiences and many similar perceptions about the forces that had helped to shape their lives. Despite the unifying life themes that were shared by these women from diverse backgrounds and varied circumstances, one life event emerged in the stories of a small group of women that seemed so powerful as to overshadow all other events and to dominate the story itself. These women told of the death occurring while they were still children of a mother or father. A death, whether it was sudden or came at the end of a long illness, divided childhood into a clear before and after. All subsequent development, all further happiness or disappointments, began with the reality of death and loss, a reality that always seemed to be there, no matter how much time had passed. Since I was writing a book about female development and not about early loss, I took these powerful and moving stories and stored them somewhere at the back of my mind, not quite sure that I would ever be able to find a way to make them public. I continued to believe that loss was not something I would ever write about. Then I received a call from a young woman who had been my student for years. She was a charming and bright woman who, by anyone's account, had it all: a loving husband, 2 healthy children, successful career, classic good looks, and a trust fund that freed her from financial worries for the rest of her life. Yet on the phone she sounded frightened. She wanted to see me. She needed to talk. She had found a lump in her breast and was going for a biopsy. Over the next 15 months, I listened to her fears and her hopes, her anger and her bargains with God, her eventual acceptance, and her overwhelming weariness. Throughout throughout her ordeal and her dying, she had only one concern: her children. A young son and an infant daughter. She ached and wept as she thought of their growing up without a mother. She loved her life and she did not want to die. She adored her husband and did not want to leave him. But it was for her children that she begged God to let her live just a little longer. As I sat in the church and listened to the minister eulogize a loving mother and a devoted wife, I could not take my eyes from her 4-year-old son, a boy dressed like a man for an occasion he did not understand, but one that would change the terms of his life forever. He may not have known it then, but he had just been struck by a lightning bolt. As I left the church, I felt desperate to make some sense of this untimely and tragic loss. Her death would become my mission. If she could face death, I could certainly face thinking and writing about the trauma of early loss. Once I decided to write The Loss That Is Forever, I could allow myself to acknowledge that I had lived in the shadow of early loss my entire life. My mother lost her father when she was 6. His death, a sudden event from which she has probably never recovered, changed her life then and shaped who she became. I always knew that parents could die young. I had only to think of the faceless grandfather who was known by his absence. Throughout my childhood, I was forever calculating how many years of parenting I would need before I would be old enough to survive on my own, and then pleading with God to let my parents live long enough to launch me into adulthood safely. As a grown woman, my childhood fears seemed quite far away, yet as I had not escaped the reach of early loss. My husband of almost 20 years lost his father when he was only 3. My husband almost never mentions his father. He barely knew the man who gave him life. Yet his father's death was probably the single event that determined who he has become, what he fears, and what he treasures. My husband is a wonderful man, and I know that some of what I love most about him grew not from his strengths, but from his vulnerabilities that were etched deep when his father died. Some events are so big and so powerful that they cannot help but change everything we touch. When we think about change, we often ask ourselves whether the change was for the good or for the bad. Politicians ask us every election day, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And when we fail to reach some longed-for goal, we often rationalize that it was for the best. Change without judgment is something we find hard to make sense of. Yet the change in a child's life following the death of a parent is the change that just is. A girl who lost her father learns how to be independent and self-reliant. Is that good or bad? Another girl develops compassion for people in pain and in need. Is that good or bad? A boy becomes more cautious in his relationships, waiting before he commits himself. Is that good or bad? Early loss sets a child on a particular path, and like all roads, it has detours and potholes and smooth patches. It is the road that will lead. It is the road that will lead that child to become a certain man or a particular woman. Would another road have been better? Who knows? All we can say is that it would have been different. When a tree is struck by lightning, if it survives, its growth is altered. A knot may form where the lightning hit. The growth on one side of the tree may be more vigorous than on the other side. The shape of the tree may change. An interesting twist or a curious split has replaced what might have otherwise been a straight line. The tree flourishes. It bears fruit, provides shade, becomes a home to birds and squirrels. It is not the same tree it would have been if there had not been a lightning storm. Some say it is more interesting this way. Few can even remember the event that changed its shape forever. Just over 5% of children under the age of 18 grow to adulthood needing to make sense of profound loss. They are the survivors of the early death of a mother or father. Most because men tend to die young at higher rates than women have lost fathers. Okay. A tragic few have lost both parents. Despite the greater prevalence of father loss, more has been written about the impact of losing a mother. Mother loss seems more tragic, or so we imagine. Fairy tale characters from Bambi and Babar to Cinderella, Snow White, are all survivors of the early death of a mother. The recent bestseller Motherless Daughters tells the moving stories of scores of women who grew up without the guidance and secure love of a mother. Yet what about all the men and women who longed for a loving father, a strong protector, a trusted mentor? Disney's The Lion King tells the story of young Simba, who witnesses the violent death of his father and must grow up with only a few fleeting memories of his powerful father to guide him. One does not need a modern fairy tale or the groundbreaking work of the women's movement or the rallying cry of the men's movement to tell us how important fathers are. One only has to listen to the stories of those who lost fathers to know how important they are and how much their loss hurts. When a child loses a parent, a father, or a mother, that child grows up feeling different and alone. A story is written in a secret place, in that child's mind, a story of loss and pain and the triumph over that pain. Because there is no place to share that story, it remains intensely private, hidden sometimes even from the child. The Loss That Is Forever, this book, recounts the stories of 66 men and women who had the desire and the courage to share their stories of loss and its lifelong legacy. The sample. 66 men and women, 30 men and 36 women, were each interviewed for up to 3 hours. All of the interviewees were self-selected and responded to an open letter that described the project and invited interested men and women to call for an interview. While this was in no way a scientific sampling, some attempt was made to balance the number of men and women. The interviewees resided in one of 6 large urban areas at the time of the interview, as is often the case with people who settle in big cities. Many had migrated from smaller towns and rural settings. 25 of those interviewed had lost mothers, while 41 had experienced the death of a father. The age at which the interviewees had been orphaned varied from a few months to almost 18 years of age. 24 were from 0 to 5 years, 22 from 6 to 12, and 20 from 13 to 18 years. At the time of the interview, the sample ranged in age from 24 to 66 years. I was most interested in men and women who had reached early midlife or beyond, since it was the lifelong impact of early loss that I wanted to understand. 80% of the sample were of European American descent, with 20% being of African, Caribbean, and Asian American origins. Of this latter group, 80% were African American. 15% of the sample were gay or lesbian. 100% of those interviewed had taken at least one college course. However, even of those who completed college, many did so by stretching their college careers over many years, often combining college with some work experience. At the time of the interview, 55% were either married or living in a relationship of at least 1 year's duration. 45% currently had children, although many more intended to become parents. In recounting the demographics of the men and women I interviewed, I do not pretend to wrap my work in the garb of scientific sampling. Rather, I would like the reader, as much as is possible, without compromising confidentiality, to know who these men and women are. So often, when we listen to a story, we must be able to feel that the story speaks directly to us, is about someone like us, before we can really hear what the story has to say. It is my hope that every reader can find a kindred spirit among the many stories presented here. Stories are presented using pseudonyms to protect the privacy of the interviewees. At times, identifying details have been altered. All of the material is from the 66 people who consented to be interviewed, even when, in a short vignette, the speaker is referred to in the third person as one man or one woman. The interview, and the final part of the preface here. All of the interviews were audio taped. They took place either at my home or office, in the interviewee's home or office, or when I was interviewing out of town in a hotel room. The site and time of the interview were selected to accommodate the interviewee's schedule and level of comfort. The interview was a modified clinical interview that was loosely structured chronologically. In general, I let people tell their stories. Asking questions and providing direction were appropriate. People came to the interviews with mixed expectations. Some were looking for answers. They wanted me to help make sense of feelings and reactions that they usually did not feel free to share. Others came armed with a box of tissues, ready for a good cry. Many came hoping to help someone else. Despite what I told them about my own goals for the book, they imagined that I was working with some newly orphaned boy or girl who would be helped by what they had to tell me. Only a few began the interview by telling me that the death of a parent had really not affected their lives, but they would be glad to do the interview in order to help me. All of the people I interviewed found the interview moving and meaningful. Some jokingly called it free therapy. Others just felt that telling the story was something they needed to do periodically. Most people cried. Some were surprised by the depth of the feeling they still had for a parent who had been dead for so long. As a clinical psychologist and a writer, I spend my professional life listening as other people tell their stories. I have been told, and I have come to believe, that I am a good interviewer. People feel safe and comfortable telling me their stories. But no experience I have had in over 20 years as a psychologist and therapist can compare to doing the interviews for this book. I often felt that people were letting me enter a space so personal and so sacred that I should lower my voice to a whisper. Many times I cried as people spoke of their loss. There were some stories I still cannot tell without crying. My tears were rarely tears of sadness. Most of the time I cried in awe of the incredible strength and courage I heard described. Each person came to me with only one story. By the time I completed the interviews, I had 66 stories. 66 journeys through tragedy and loss to resolution, and in some cases even triumph. The stories seeped into my core. I dreamed about them, thought about them at the oddest times. Not only the interviewees, but the phantoms of lost parents became my mental companions. At one point, I felt so drawn into the stories I was retelling that I feared I would die while writing this book. One night, I had a dream. I was sitting at my desk, thinking, and an idea for a new book occurred to me. I became excited and animated. The dream became a swirl of creative activity. As I grabbed books from the shelves and began making notes, I kept thinking, this is such a good idea. I have to remember it when I wake up. When I awoke, I was relieved. I took the dream as a sign that my life was not over. The dream meant I could think about death, feel the pain of accumulated loss, and still live. In the dream, I was committing myself to new ideas, to creativity, to life. I did not have to be swept away by the awesome power of death. Eventually, I came to see my dream as a metaphor for the healing that so many survivors of early loss must undergo. At some point, one makes a commitment to life, to love, to creativity, to joy, and to continued personal growth. To live does not mean that we forget the dead. it does mean that we embrace life and move forward. I hope this book will help survivors on that journey. And that's the preface. I begin with chapter 1 from part 1, in the beginning, chapter 1, the language of loss. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you.